This is Retrohammer, Chaos Renegade Army List from 1988 and the Never Seen, Lost and the Damned. Immediately following the publication of The Realm of Chaos Slaves to Darkness in early 1988, adverts were run in White Dwarf advertising the second volume of the series, The Lost and the Damned. This tome was to characterise the chaos gods of Tzeentch and Nurgle along with their demonic minions, thus completing the exploration of the pantheon of the most powerful warp entities influencing the Warhammer universe. The mortal followers of these horrific denizens were also to receive a detailed examination, such as a Nurgle-defiled Death Guard and the Thousand Sons bound in service of Tzeentch, far less prominent than the fallen Astartes of the traitor legions, but still a dire threat to the Imperium with the disparate and fickle forces of the Chaos Renegades. Sentient beings are all susceptible to the lure of chaos, its ready offers of power and individual aggrandizement, and those whose desire and dedication are strong enough embark on the destructive road of service in the name of their chosen god, chasing the seductive promise of immortal power as a demon prince. Such individuals become the champions of their deities, Chaos Renegades, ever biting at the heels of the Imperium of Man. A single Chaos Renegade is of little threat, however, and even when supported by an established warband, they can only really hope to wander the wastes of their worlds, committing the occasional atrocity in the name of chaos, before running from the might of the planetary defence forces. There are some renegades whose resources are far greater and lead large warbands and have hulking space transports to move them between the stars and visit misery to the hapless worlds they happen upon. These warlords even command the fealty of lesser champions treading the precipitous path towards immortality. As well as these worshippers of chaos gods, they draw further forces to their banner, mercenaries for hire, pirates, and other degenerate scum prepared to work for any master who will pay them. Various weak-minded unfortunates also accompany the renegade army, willingly or otherwise, hapless masses invariably and gleefully expended by the champions as cannon fodder. Such warlords may even catch the attention of the legionnaires, and may find themselves supported by traitor Astartes, and it is these hosts that present the gravest threat of all. This rich tapestry of forces was represented in the Chaos Renegade Army List from White Dwarf 107, published in October 1988. This was a rare glimpse of how The Lost and the Damned was originally planned to be written, in the same style as Slaves to Darkness, and the other armies of the chapter-approved and ultimately Warhammer 40,000 compendium. This early element was never to be published in the intended tome, however, and The Lost and the Damned was significantly rewritten over the next 2 years, with the final work presenting a new, more streamlined army list that was indicative of how battlefields in the Dark Millennium would play as the game moved towards its second edition. And thank you very much for joining me for this episode of Retrohammer, where I'm going to take you through an exploration of the original Chaos Renegade Army List from White Dwarf 107 in late 1988. Chaos Renegades have been a reoccurring theme in Warhammer 40,000 games throughout the years, and it's been revisited by Games Workshop and of course Forge World over the years in various guises. All of them trace their roots back to the army list that was published in this White Dwarf, and it was indeed an experimental army list. And, well, it was experimental. It was fully fleshed out and it was ready to play. It never actually made it into the published Lost and the Damned in the form that we're going to look at it today, because it was completely rewritten. And, as I said in the introduction, what we finally got was more in the style of a second edition army list. And I'm also going to share all my personal experiences of gaming this back in this era, because this corresponded to when I first got into the hobby, and indeed this White Dwarf here, 107, was the first White Dwarf I ever bought. Now, this isn't my copy of 107, sold it many years ago, but this is a near mint copy that I've acquired since, and it's perfect to revisit this interesting piece of 40k history. Let's open up the magazine and have a look. As I say, yes, November 1988 this was, and what interests us here is this Chaos Renegade army here, and it was written by Brian Ansell and Mike Brunton. And I mentioned at the start how we'd seen adverts very early on for The Lost and the Damned, and this is one such advert, and the artwork's familiar. It says down here, the second part of Realm of Chaos available soon. And what actually happened was, well, it was actually 1990 before it was released. And we can substantiate that even further if we look at the order page, and here we had Slaves to Darkness available for sale And here we had The Lost and the Damned, winter release, $14.99. You can stick a note on that price now if you want to get a good copy. But as I say, it was never released in its original format, and it came along in a much different guise years later. So anyway, let's move to the actual realm of Chaos Renegade Army List. This was a relatively short article, but for me and some of my friends who gamed it, it had an awful lot of use. We played this a huge amount. There was a nice little story, as in an interesting story. It wasn't nice for the protagonists involved. And then a bit of an introduction to what the army list was. And essentially, the idea of the Chaos Renegade Army List was, it was like a bolt-on to the warband system that had been presented in Slaves to Darkness. And the Slaves to Darkness system gave you the rules to create the Renegades and their inner circle, their warband. And this Renegade Army List presented a set of, in effect, expendable add-on troops to build the points of a force up and allow you to game full-size tabletop combat games with it, as opposed to the much smaller skirmish-style games that the actual original Renegade Warband system was aimed at. So, what do we have here? So this was the background to the rules. Now, there's lots of interesting things here that tells us a lot about the nature of the game at the time. Here it deals with the early established and important rivalries between the Chaos powers, and it basically said that you couldn't have a renegade following a warlord of an opposing power. However, you could have renegades of opposing powers under a warlord of a non-opposing power. So in other words, if you had a renegade warlord who was a worshipper of Khorne, you couldn't have a Slaaneshi renegade following him. However, you could have a renegade of Tzeentch and Nurgle as part of his force. That was permissible. And so straight away, it kind of like gave you a lot of variety. And variety is something that this army list did better than anything else that followed it. If you'd played with Slaves to Darkness, you might have an established warband that you could drop straight in and value up. Or you could generate one from scratch if you were wanting to build an army from the ground up. So that was a neat little feature. It gave some equipment. Renegade always got powered armour, a teleport homer, a knife and frag grenades, and then they could buy additional equipment. You could equip other units in your force with teleport homers, which is all important for getting out of sticky situations. One really fun part of this list was the vehicle options. Basically, you rolled for every battle to see what sort of world you were on. You could either get a medieval or feral world, in which case your only transport option to loot and plunder were horses. You could get a frontier world, which presented you with a mixture of horses and the technological vehicles of a developed world. And then a developed world restricted you to vehicles only. And of course, these vehicles you could mount weapons on that the Renegade owned. And then it gave you also some vehicle profiles in the format of the first edition Rogue Trader book. And this was very much in the era of the more adult style Grim Darkness wargame. And here we had this quote here by a charming renegade called Derod Nurmi, the despoiler of Abon IV, attributed to: "Kill them all. I do not want their loyalty, their service, their hearts, their arms, or their goods. I want to hear their screams." Chaos Renegades weren't nice. And that was one of the fascinating things about this list. It was clearly and obviously portraying really, really bad guys, horribly bad guys, and yet it was compelling and an awful lot of fun to play. It further reinforced the precedent set by the original 40k game of who's a good guy. You can play any perspective you want in this universe. You can play the humans, the Imperium, who are nominally goodish, all the way through to their arch-evil nemesis, the Chaos Renegades. It also then gave some rules around creating unusual units, so allowed you to create an interesting mix and match of creature types in a unit, and this just gave you rules for how to mix them together without, say, a creature that causes fear scaring off their own unit. Cool little bit of art here of some Marines locked in desperate combat with a bunch of Chaos Renegades. One of the, shall we say, very novel parts of this list was the slave troops, and this was when we first saw the explosive collar appear in Warhammer 40,000, which is on to feature in various armies. The rules here for how to game those slaves and their unique expendability in the force. And then there was finally a section of rules around survivors from a battle. So there's two ways you could do this. You could basically replace any lost units that were the add-ons. Obviously you would deal with your warbands, casualties on a case-by-case basis, or you could carry them over between battles and represent fragments of units that fought in previous battles being redeployed again and perhaps fighting alongside fresh strength units. We will come back to this because we're going to look at a second White Dwarf where a further article was published expanding the detail around this greatly. Then we get into the actual army list itself, and the way this was worked, you had to have a Chaos Renegade warlord and their warband, and you had various equipment options available. You could then have up to 3 lesser renegades supporting the warlord, following the restrictions of deity loyalty I talked about before. And then there were a variety of demons that could accompany the warband. You could have a number of possessees, squads of lesser demons, a greater demon, a summoned demon prince, and demonic familiars for any psychers in the force. Now, these were very powerful troops. However, they were also subjected to the effects of demonic instability. While you could create very powerful forces by adding demons in, they might evaporate and you find yourself woefully outmatched on the actual game. This is a bit that I and my friends really got into and enjoyed, which was Immortal Followers, the additional forces for a Chaos Renegade Army List. And it was in here that we built our really large Renegade Army forces up. We played games with 200 to 300 models aside using these lists, and it was great fun. And it really was 40k Rogue Trader at its best in my view. These games were so much fun and had so much character. I mean, one of the things was that you didn't have lots of elite troops. Your only elite troop option was here, and you could have 1 Traitor Legion detachment. They had to be loyal to the Warlord's Chaos God, which meant that you could be, as Slanesh, you could be accompanied by Emperor's Children and Tzeentch by the Thousand Sons. And I guess as well, if you really wanted, you could include the Black Legion in this list. Right, then what were the Mortal Followers? You could have up to D6 Renegade Psychics, and each of these troop types had a whimsical description of that particular unit type, and they're quite funny, some of these. So the first we had was Human Degenerate Squads, and this has a fun little description. It says, many who turn to chaos lack the willpower and drive to become part of a renegade's inner retinue. Denied such importance, they fight with a fanaticism born of desperation, uncaring that they are little better than cannon fodder. These are just like 5-man squads of humans. As this was a chaos list, you could give them chaos attributes as well. You had to be careful with giving them attributes because some attributes could really unbalance their battlefield effectiveness. I mean, I think most of the time when we played, we didn't add attributes to these troops. The next were kind of like your good quality troops, Orc Henchmen. So these were good because they had better armour, better weapons and better options than the Human Degenerates. You could have up to 4 of those. And it said orcs can be found anywhere wherever the opportunity for a fight and plunder presents itself. Although few serve chaos directly, their love of violence and plunder is often harnessed by chaos renegades. You've got the great mix of orcs and humans fighting side by side. To make the mix even more eclectic, you could then have up to 8 squads of 5 beastmen. The beastmen obviously fit well, and out of all the troops you could take, you'd have those with a lot of chaos mutations, and they would make up effective combat troops, or reasonably effective I suppose you'd say. You could then have some heavy infantry in the form of an Ogrin squad, which are basically just armed with clubs. And then we move into the true fodder part of this army list. First we had the Gretchens. You could take 6 squads of Gretchens, 5 Gretchens at 14 points a squad, so these were super cheap. They were actually even cheaper than the expendable slave troopers. And you could actually make the Gretchen more effective in a way, because you could give them mesh armour, which was actually made them better armoured than the Human Degenerates and the Mutant Beastmen, which is quite funny really. And finally, we had the slave troops, and you're allowed to take up to 100 slave troops at 4 points each. 400 points, which was less than the cost of 20 tactical marines at the time. You could have a big block of 100 slaves. And these have a fun little description, which is, doomed but desperate enough to believe otherwise, slaves are herded into a single unit and given an objective to take or destroy. An armed mob, they are often released ahead of a renegade unit, where their despairing ferocity can do the most damage to the enemy. The slaves know that those who falter in the attack instantly destroyed. Yes, that's quite true. If they failed a morale check and a renegade could see them, all the explosive collars were set off, they were destroyed. And that was the list. That was the whole thing. Very short. It was only, 7 or 8 pages long. But that is the list. And although it's a short little list, this, for me and my friends, had immense gaming potential. And we played so many warband games. And it was just great fun. It was so open-ended, so versatile. It was just quite a different style of fights compared to the Space Marine dominant games that we'd originally got used to. So that was the list. Now, you'll remember that I said there was some expanded rules around casualties or survivors. So we need to go forward another month in 1988 to December and White Dwarf 108. And in White Dwarf 108, a follow-on set of rules was published, which complemented the list of 107. And is this article here called Survival of the Fittest, where Mike Brunton and Rick Priestley, with everything you ever wanted to know about casualties, pillaging, and getting the most from your figures in Realm of Chaos. Aha, Adeptus Titanicus. Well, here's a game that's might be making a reappearance soon. But yes, that was released around this time. The mail order page was carrying an advert for Lost and the Damned being released shortly, which it, as I say, it wasn't. And here we have the article Survival of the Fittest. This was a very broad set of rules that was designed to complement the Chaos Renegade Warband and the Chaos Renegade Army List, and it also was equally usable in Warhammer Fantasy Battle for Chaos Champions. But the whole thing was, it allowed you to represent the effects of injuries and casualties to your units as you played games in this era. And there's some art here of some very old classic Chaos Renegade miniatures. But basically what it did is it gave you a set of tables that allowed you to determine what had happened, any models that had been removed as a casualty during a game. It works with a classic principle of someone taken off your table during a game isn't necessarily dead, and you would make a roll to see what happened. Anything from wounded, knocked out or otherwise slightly injured and a fine, minor injury or 6 is dead. And I suppose that made for a fun way of modelling progression, and this was particularly important for your Chaos Renegades, who were very important persistent characters. And if you got a serious injury, let's say this result here, you would roll on the table to see what happened. You might have your stat line affected as a result. There were further rules here for rewards and survivors as well. And then also pillaging. So this was really important for 40k because 40k is so equipment centric. Vehicles, dreadnoughts, robots, heavy weapons in particular are very important in 40k, and this gave you rules that would allow you to salvage hardware and equipment from the battlefield from the defeated side, and this just further added to the eclectic mix and variety of what units, vehicles and weaponry that a 40k Chaos Renegade Warband could be made up of. Really interesting stuff. Just something to look at here. A little bit off topic, but if you've ever wondered what the original art concepts for Plague Marines and Nurgle Renegades look like, well, there you go, there's one of the pictures of the time. Very different, more horrific style of art to what 8th edition has presented us. And then there was finally a set of rules for reorganising the remains of wounded units after battle, and then it even talks a little bit about how to convert and the modelling opportunities around that as well. And that was that. And I guess between those two short articles and Realm of Chaos Slaves to Darkness, that was everything that was published for the Rogue Trader era gaming Chaos Renegades in 40k. After this set of articles and Slaves to Darkness, we're all, certainly the people around at the time, me included, we were all very excited for the appearance of Lost and the Damned, but it never came. It never came when we expected it to, and as I say, it was well into 1990 before it was published. And when it was published, although the lore firmly remained in the sort of grimdark or adult horror theme that Slaves to Darkness was and these were, the style of the army list had already changed significantly and was moving towards a streamlined 2nd edition army list style. So yeah, it was a bit of a missed opportunity, it felt, but I guess they had their own creative direction. I don't know if it was a missed opportunity because The Lost and the Damned was still a really great book. It was a brilliant book, and I would certainly rate it alongside Slaves to Darkness. For me, it was just one of those what-ifs. If they had published it in the original style that they planned to do, it would have completed the project that they'd started around the Dark Millennium in Slaves to Darkness. So I hope you've enjoyed this exploration of the Chaos Renegade Army List as it was originally going to be presented, and apart from these handful of White Dwarf articles, evaporated into the mists of time. And this episode was voted for by my Patreons, and I would just like to take this opportunity to thank them all in person for supporting me with making Retrohammer videos. Patreons like Red Panda 7, Laurent Jaloux, Diego Flores, KL, Zerius, Alexander Korn, John Richardson, Notspunny, Patriots, Robert Allen Fairburn IV, Stuart Watley and Mikey Royce. If you enjoy the Retrohammer series and you would like to have a say in what episodes get made in the future, you can do so by supporting me through Patreon. You can support me and channel Leakycheese for as little as $1 a month. You'll be able to vote every month in a poll that I'm going to hold for the Patreon supported episode, and I'll be presenting 4 of these to the Patreons each month to vote on. The next vote will be starting on the 1st of November and it will be open for a week. At the end of that week, the idea with the most votes will be made into November's episode of Retrohammer. So if you do enjoy Retrohammer, indeed anything else I do on this channel, Patreon's a great way to do it. That was Retrohammer. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.